Before we go into our interview today, I wanted to let everyone know we have a new sponsor for our Energy Question podcast, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, or USOGA for short. First established in 1917, USOGA has been an effective and creative voice for the industry for more than a century now. USOGA is dedicated to educating the public, policymakers, and legislators at the federal, state, and local levels about the value of the domestic oil and natural gas industry. If you're in the industry and not currently a USOGA member, please consider joining the association as a way of helping it tell your story to the policymakers whose actions impact everything you do each and every day. You can start that process by contacting USOGA through its website, usoga.org. Thanks so much to USOGA for sponsoring the Energy Question podcast. And now on with our show. Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm your host, David Blackmon, and our special guest today is Todd Snitchler. Is back again. He's the president of EPSA, the Electric Power Supply Association in Washington, D.C., our nation's beautiful capital that, we won't talk about that. Todd, how are you doing today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me again, David. It's good to be with you.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you, man. Before we get into the Q&A, though, just remind our readers,
Sure.
About EPSA's mission and who its members are and the highlights of the association.
Sure, happy to do it. Thanks for the opportunity to do so. EPSA is the Electric Power Supply Association, as you said. We're the only national trade association that represents independent power producers for all the power producers in the restructured markets across the country, from California to Texas to the Mid-Atlantic to New England. Our members own all types of resources, about 150,000 or so megawatts of everything from coal to natural gas to nuclear to wind, solar, battery storage, even a little bit of hydro. So our members have the full gamut of resources. They are active participants in all of the markets across the country and are very focused on ensuring system reliability and delivering power at the least cost, because our model is different than some of our utility and public power and rural co-op cousins in that we don't have captive customers. We sell power into the wholesale market. And so we have every incentive to be as inexpensive, as reliable, and as clean as we can possibly be.
Well, of course, you mentioned system reliability.
Sure.
That's a growing weakness, frankly, in our various grids across the country. What germinated the invitation for this return interview is the situation in New York State, where Micron, a big chip making company, wants to put two major chip plants in upstate New York. And the state ISO is now warning that, we're not sure we're going to have adequate generation capacity to add that, plus all the EVs and everything else we're adding to the power grid right now. Talk about what's happening up there.
Yeah, it's an example of what's happening not just in New York, but in a lot of places. But specific to the Micron facility, they are trying to add it's going to take a number of years to get there, of course, but it amounts to the same amount of power that would be required to power the city of Buffalo 24/7, 365, where I've seen a couple of reports that say it's the amount of power it would take to power Vermont and New Hampshire together. Just for this one facility. Correct. It's basically almost 2,000 megawatts would be needed when the plant is fully constructed and at max operations. So it's a substantial amount of energy that would be needed. I saw a report that the New York ISO did that I believe it'll add between 5 and 7% of energy demand to New York's existing demand just for this facility. And of course, they want to do more, which what state doesn't, right? We all like jobs. And, when you're talking about tens of billions of dollars of investment, it's really great to make the announcement. The difficulty becomes, can you actually produce the power that's needed? And Micron's agreement says they're going to buy 100% renewable power. Well, the other challenge that you run into, and it's not unique to New York, but it happens there, is it's siting and permitting, and then the actual construction and connection to the system. The amount of resources that would be needed in order to power that system to be constructed in the next, I think it's 9 years or so, that much power hasn't been added to New York's grid in the last 50 years. And so that becomes the problem, because we all want the things that sound great and would be great economic development drivers. The challenge, of course, becomes how do you actually go ahead and achieve the goal that you've set? And that's where New York is it looks like they're going to fall short. And there have been a number of folks that have said as much, that it's not a question of can we do it? It's we're not going to be able to do it. So how do we try to put a Band-Aid on this and fix it? And it's not going to be unique to New York, because the CHIPS Act that was passed by Congress is trying to reshore a lot of this manufacturing
Sure.
computer chips. And wherever you build it, you're going to need a lot of power, and it's going to need to be reliable 24/7, 365. Intermittent doesn't work for a manufacturing facility of that nature.
No, and of course at WEF, we're recording this the day after their adjourning in Davos. The head of
Oh, right.
OpenAI is talking about the need for a big, huge advancement in renewable generation
Mm-hmm.
to help power the extraordinary load that AI is going to now put on the power system
Mm-hmm.
right now. And that's in addition to all the electric vehicles we're supposed to be adding and all the all electric homes now. We're getting rid of gas stoves and gas appliances. Is any of this in any way sustainable over such a short period of time as they're talking about?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question for those of us old enough to remember that show. The challenge becomes, can it be done, and can it be done on a timeline that makes sense? And our concern is that there are very aggressive aspirational policy goals that have been established by policymakers at the state and federal level. The challenge is there is a huge delta between the aspirational policy goals and the operational realities of the system. And when you read NERC's report, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation's assessment of reliability concerns, they have most of the country under some heightened degree of a reliability concern today. And that looks forward and says, it's not a prediction, it's an assessment, but they say with the retirements of dispatchable resources, that's going to continue to go up. And their number one risk to the system was added in the most recent report, and they said it's policy decisions. And
Yeah.
so they're highlighting that delta between aspirational policy goals and system operational requirements. And that, I think, is what is going to really drive the headaches that are sure to come, because we are finally on a track where we're going to see increased electricity demand. That has been flat to negative for probably the last 20 years. And now we're seeing it go up. I think I saw PJM, the largest market in the United States, says they're predicting 4.7% year-over-year growth in the system, which we haven't seen in a long time. And so you're going to need a lot of resources that are going to be able to both produce reliably, but also sufficient power for all the things that you mentioned and more that are going to come onto the system. And that's a very big lift, and it's a very challenging one, given the environment that we're in with supply chain and with siting and permitting and
Oh my
all the other
gosh.
things that come with it.
Now, all this is happening in New York, right, and the Northeast,
Yeah.
as and you talk about public policies. Uh, at the same time, all this rising demand is happening, all these new loads on the system.
Mm-hmm.
New York policymakers are also embarking on these big plans to retire their natural gas,
Yeah.
fuel oil, nuclear, and coal plants, right?
Yeah, they have I always forget the name because every state has a different title for it, but they have a zero emissions target by 2035, I believe, is when they want to have it done. And so that requires them to move off of the significant amount of fossil-based resources that they're using now, predominantly natural gas. But it's 50% of New York's supply or more today. And again, coming back to that, how fast and how much can you permit, can you site, and can you interconnect in the next 5 to 10 years, it becomes a very difficult task to achieve. And in fact, our colleague in New York, Gavin Donahue, who's with IPNI, the Independent Power Producers of New York, says it's impossible. So
Yeah.
given the current requirements and timelines, it can't be done. And so then it becomes, well, what are we going to do in order to keep the system reliable, to keep the lights on? And really the piece that people forget to talk about is how much is this going to cost? Because ultimately consumers, including companies like Micron that are going to either invest or not, have to pay the bill, and the bill could be substantial.
So and of course I write about what's happening in the Northeast
Sure.
quite a bit, and what we've seen over the past couple of years now is what I consider to be actually kind of a mental illness. And that's all these policymakers in places like New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, thinking that offshore wind,
Mhm.
which is the least efficient, most expensive form of power generation available today, offshore wind is somehow going to resolve all these problems? Is offshore wind the answer to any aspect of this problem?
I think the question really comes down to, are we going to be able to actually get an offshore wind project that is more than on paper? And I say that
Right.
because there's one project that's been developed, and I believe it's connected to the system now. That's Vineyard Wind in New England, but that has been
One
15
turbine,
years in the
yes.
making or
Yeah.
more. But we've seen a lot of announcements, and as a recovering politician, you always love to have things happen in your district, and you'd like to do the ribbon cuttings. And so announcements had been made, and then very quietly over the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen a lot of those contracts and announcements be unwound or canceled. The utilities or the developers have said it's too expensive. Interest rates and supply chain related issues, permitting and siting have made those projects not even doable, including the subsidies and the preferred treatment that they were getting by some of the policymakers. So right now, there's aspirational hopes for tens of thousands of megawatts of offshore wind, and there is one project that is producing hundreds of megawatts of resources, but that's been 15 years in the making. So
Yeah.
I think that the investment decisions that other resources are being forced to make because state policymakers say they want certain resources to come on, but they can't. It's driving investment and retirement decisions that further undermine reliability of the system, and that's a real concern.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing I want to be sure to talk about today is transmission, and the
Yeah.
big piece of this that transmission becomes, because when you build these wind farms, regardless if they're offshore or onshore,
Mhm.
then they have to be built out in the country somewhere or offshore, hundreds of miles away from the load centers, New
Mhm.
York City or whatever it is. And then you have to get the transmission permitted, and all the rights of way secured,
Mhm.
and the financing in place. That also is an enormous cost and problem from a timing perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you've captured a lot of the issues because it's not merely do we need more, do we want more transmission? The answer is probably yes to both. We are going to need additional transmission. There are those that seem to suggest that transmission is a solution to everything, and I take maybe a different view, and that you've got to have a generating resource somewhere that's going to move
Somewhere.
power across those lines. But that being said, the challenge is no longer that we need to have some of those lines, but many of the advocates that have opposed the natural gas pipeline infrastructure and resources that power the natural gas combined cycle units and peaking units, the techniques that have been applied to frustrate those projects are going to be applied to people that are trying to do transmission projects, because you end up with, it's not NIMBY anymore, it's banana, it's build absolutely nothing anytime anywhere, and that is creating real problems. Because if you agree that we need to have more of everything, then you're going to have to be able to site and construct and permit and do all the work that's required in a timely basis. And I think there was a transmission line that finally was put into service. And I think the news story I read about it says that, that transmission line has been in process so long, it's old enough to vote now. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the
Transwest.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't just happen overnight. And the fact that it takes so long for things to get done is really what is going to frustrate some of these policymaker objectives. And that's being debated in Washington, of course, with the permitting and siting reform. Again, I look at it and say, there's a deal to be made here. The grand bargain's pretty simple. You're going to have to make pipelines easier to site and permit, and then you can get your transmission lines as part of that bargain. But it's so obvious that it doesn't seem the politicians are able to figure out how to make that deal happen.
Well, and of course, the real problem, of course, is, and I agree, there's a need to reform the permitting processes,
Mhm.
but we live in a society that protects everyone's rights. Okay, we're in a free society. Everybody has rights, and the government and all these laws and regulations are in place mainly to protect the rights not just of people, but also of endangered species and view sheds and all these environmental related issues
Sure.
too. And if you can only go so far in streamlining processes until you get to the point where you're infringing on someone's rights.
Yeah.
And and so when you really boil this all down, it almost seems like, to me anyway, that trying to do all of this in such a short
span of time is frankly incompatible with a free society. And you're going to come down to all this tension between protection of rights and the desire to get all this done fast. And I just wonder if you see that as well, if I'm just crazy.
No, I think you raised the issue of environmental justice. That is one of the things that has been talked about as, how do we try to ensure that no communities are left behind or no communities are disproportionately impacted for any type of resource, whether it's existing resources or new resources. And that adds another layer of complexity, to be sure, in trying to address how these objectives can be achieved. Now, I think you've seen developers and others work much harder than they may have in the past to be proactive in engaging with communities in order to secure buy-in, as opposed to I'm going to show up and we're just going to do X and you're going to have to deal with it. That's not a great business model, I don't think, in general, given the climate that we're in more broadly. But I think companies are trying to be much more thoughtful about how they attack this process, because when you get the local community in your corner and people understand what the benefits are, then you have a much easier time going through the process. And so the successful developers are doing that, as opposed to trying to get their project approved and then back in to try and find public support. I think that's the way to help satisfy some of the issues that you've raised, because if you do it the wrong way, I can assure you it's not going to work and you're going to have strong public opposition. And then the things that people say they want to achieve, I think you're right. If you do it the wrong way, you're just simply not going to be able to do it.
Yeah. So none of these issues are isolated to the Northeast. I want to be
That's
sure and
correct.
talk about, we had pretty good news in Texas actually this week when we had a big freeze event. ERCOT was pretty concerned about having enough generation on the system, dispatchable in particular on the second day of this cold front. But the grid passed with flying colors. And what do you think about that? Have we fixed all the problems on the Texas grid?
That's a really big question. I'll take the smaller question and say that I think everyone understood after the last couple of winter events, Winter Storm Uri and then Winter Storm Elliott, that there needed to be a wholesale review of practices, procedures, and what the entire energy value chain was doing, not just generators, not just suppliers, not just the producers, but the entire value chain. And I think the improved performance of the system, not just in Texas, but across the country, in a pretty significant part of the country having very cold temperatures, and the system performed well, suggests that people are making sure they're doing the things that are required. You have to remain ever vigilant. I mean, just because we've gotten through the first storm, it's only January, mid-January as we're recording this. That means we're probably going to have more cold weather events this winter. So people need to continue to be on top of that. But I think it suggests that the signals can be put into place to drive behaviors from generators, suppliers, pipeline entities, the whole value chain to perform better. And as long as we continue to do our part and the other parts of the value chain do theirs, I think we can keep the system operating in a very reliable fashion. But we've already had 2 strikes, and frankly, we can't afford to have a 3rd strike. And so everybody's got to be on top of their game.
Yeah, in Texas, we've added a lot of solar in the last 3 years. And of course, that helps when the sun's shining. We've added a lot of stationary battery storage that,
Yeah, like 5 gigs now, right, is what Texas
right.
has?
And yet, when you looked at ERCOT's numbers, it really was hardly contributing anything when it really counted during the peak demand times of the day. But to me, the best news was we didn't lose any gas capacity like we did during Uri. 3 years ago, we lost about 30% of our natural gas generation, even though it was still providing 50% of all the load on the system. This time, we hardly lost anything to freeze ups. And that really speaks well of all the reforms that have been put in place by policymakers and regulators over the last 3 years, and the industry too, right?
Yeah, and I think that was consistent across the country. I know that Utica and Marcellus had significant drop-offs in production during Winter Storm Elliott and didn't have that same problem this go around. And I did talk to one of our members who said, we're still trying to find, was it because of temperature? Was it because of weatherization? Were there some other things that we need to be aware of in order to make sure we're solving for the right problem? Or did we just get lucky? Because getting lucky is not a way to run a system. So let's make sure we identify the things that happened and how we need to best prepare, because it worked well. Let's make sure it works well going forward.
Yes, luck is not a plan.
Yeah,
not a
hope is
plan.
not a strategy, I think is the
Hope
quote.
is not a
So,
strategy. Yes. Um, oh, we talked about transmission and,
mhm,
we have to talk about, last time you were on, we talked a lot about the transformer
yeah.
supply crisis this was, gosh, last June. It was
Mhm.
already a really significant crisis then. What kind of progress has been made? Talk about what's happening in that realm and what progress, if any, has been made over the last 6 months.
Yeah, I wish I could report that breakthroughs had happened and success was upon us, but I think there is still serious issues with regard to the transformer situation in the supply chain. And one of the things that's become more and more evident over the last year is that people are starting to do more of the math around, well, if we're going to have more electric vehicles in a neighborhood grid system, it's not just the large transformers, but it's the neighborhood transformers that are on the poles outside your house. That if you put 3 or 4 electric vehicles onto that transformer, it means you have to upgrade that transformer or it won't be able to support the system. And if you're going to have widespread distribution of electric vehicles and you're going to see a substantial amount of energy being utilized to charge the vehicles, they'll almost all be, of course, done at night at the same time when people are home and the cars are in their garage. That means there's a significant amount of upgrades to the existing distribution system that will be required. And there is not an adequate number of even distribution transformers, let alone the transmission transformers that are required in order to keep the system operating safely and reliably. And there are issues with energy efficiency requirements from DOE for transformers. There's been a lot of debate about whether or not that rule should be held off or it should be passed. As I understand it, it has not been decided yet, but there's a ton of pressure on manufacturing. Like, where are we going to get them made from? Can we build enough
Yeah.
of them here? There's only 1 or 2 plants in all of the United States that build the distribution transformers, and we need to have more of them in our inventory because as the system does continue to evolve and adapt to the technologies that are being put onto the system, that's going to require that they be available and that they be available in a timely fashion. So I don't want to wait for the system to blow up and then have to replace it. You've got to be proactive in trying to address how we deal with some of those things. And those questions are not yet resolved. I think we're seeing discussion, which is helpful. I think that's the first part of trying to solve the problem is understanding what you're doing. But the time for talking, as Jim Robb likes to say, we've navel gazed long enough at the issue. We actually need to solve the problem. I think we're at the point now where we need to actually address the manufacturing situation and make sure that we've got the supply that we need and can continue to have it, because the system simply won't function unless we've got the right equipment.
Yeah. So Hurricane Harvey in 2017 came on shore, went up and down the Texas, Louisiana
Right.
coast for about a week, knocked out 20% of the refineries, knocked out a whole bunch of the Texas grid in East Texas.
Mm-hmm.
I was very worried going into this summer after talking to you and several others about that transformer issue. What if we have another Hurricane Harvey event? I mean, we've been real lucky with hurricane landfalls in this country the last few
Mm-hmm.
years. We haven't had anything remotely similar to that.
Yeah.
Would we have had adequate transformer supply and other supply chains, adequacy to get the grid back online in a pretty quick manner had we had a Hurricane Harvey kind of event this past summer?
Yeah, it's hard to say because it's very fact dependent on the storm and what the impacts would be. But our utility cousins have done a very good job of creating an inventory where they will share amongst themselves supplies that are available in the event that there's an outage in Florida. You'll see the utilities from other parts of the country that are not impacted, that they have worked
Right.
out their
Yeah.
internal process in order to be able to share resources. The problem becomes, and I think we're just about there, when our shelves are empty and you call and ask for help because you've had a problem and I don't have enough for my own system, I certainly can't ignore my own obligations and give you my inventory, because what if I have a problem? And so I think we're at the time and place where we're trying to make sure that those inventories can be replenished and that people then can actually utilize that sharing system that's been created, because it has performed very well. But as you know, if the shelves are empty, it becomes very difficult to replace anything. And then what do we do when the system goes down? If you're having to repair damaged transformers because you can't get new ones, it might help get the Band-Aid put on the injury, but really you've got to diagnose the root cause, and that's making sure we have adequate supply that are readily available and can be deployed when they're needed.
Well, when I talk about these things, I always sound so negative, and I hate that because all in all, you guys, your members, the power community,
Mhm.
generators, and everybody involved in it just has done an incredible job of building this grid in our country that has provided energy reliably, electricity reliably to our citizens in pretty much every imaginable circumstance.
Mhm.
And I often forget to talk about that. Yeah, and we've talked about some good news
Sure.
here in this episode, and I just think it's worth noting that you guys do an incredible job, and everyone should be thrilled to death with the fact that we have such fantastic people working on these issues in Washington and all over the country to help keep the lights on, right?
Well, and our members and the entire energy community does do a terrific job. It's the largest machine in all the world, the North American electric grid. And the best thing is when people don't have to think about it, when they can walk to their wall and click
Exactly.
on the light switch and they don't have to worry about where's my power coming from or is it actually going to come on. It's a former colleague of mine calls it the boring good. And that's what we aim to do is to do the things that are required in order to keep the lights on reliably and in a cost-effective manner. And most all of the time that happens. It's when we get into those crisis situations or storm activity that results in challenges to the system that you really see people step up from the generator community to the utilities to public power and to our friends in the rural co-ops where they really stand shoulder to shoulder to make sure that they can keep the system on and functioning because it's our number one priority. We certainly want to make sure that the system works and the public expects it as they should.
Yeah. You talk about the boring good. I had a great example of that out of this cold snap in Texas. I had written a piece prior to it hitting,
Mhm.
talking about the outlook for the grid and, everyone surviving it, and it was an optimistic piece. And, and then I had planned to write a follow-up piece at the end, but one of my editors at one of the publications I work for, when I pitched it, he said, nah, it's good news. We don't need that. So
That's unfortunate. We could use a little more good news, I think.
exactly. I would love actually for that to happen more
Yeah,
often. Well, Todd, I can't thank you enough for being on again,
sure.
and we'll continue to reach out in the future at key points, and appreciate everything you're doing.
Happy to do it, David. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and thanks to the Sandstone Group for hosting our podcast, our sponsors at the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, and our extraordinary producer, Eric Perel. I'm David Blackmon. That is all for now.